Hello, everyone. My name is Julia Herring, and welcome to Cal CPA's Tariff series. I'm an attorney at a law firm called Miller and Chevalier, located in Washington, D.C., and we have a customs and trade practice that, of course, focuses on tariffs. So since February 2025, the U.S. has imposed a series of tariffs on industries, products, and countries. The purpose of this video is to help you understand at a high level the existing tariff landscape and what we can expect to see in coming days and months. We'll also close out with a few thoughts on strategies that you can use to help limit your tariff exposure. So let's jump right in. The first thing I want to talk about today is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That's known as IEEPA. Under IEEPA, the president can regulate imports as a way to deal with any unusual and extraordinary threats. These threats oftentimes impact national security, foreign policy, or the economy of the United States. And IEEPA has been used several times this year alone to impose several different tariffs. The first of these that we saw were the fentanyl and immigration IEEPA tariffs. These were announced in February and also imposed in February. They were announced against Canada and Mexico at a 25% rate, with a 10% exception for potash and energy from Canada. And later, a USMCA, which is the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, under the USMCA, permitted compliant products to be exempt from these tariffs. So that was an addition that was made later on, which allowed, if your product is USMCA compliant, to not be subject to these IEEPA tariffs. Separately, China also was imposed an IEEPA tariff. This tariff was 20%. Now, as we know, China is not a part of the USMCA, and as a result, there was no separate USMCA exemption. Now, on April 2nd, the president announced reciprocal IEEPA tariffs. These tariffs were announced across the board to almost every country. There were certain exceptions, for example, Russia, Cuba, they have separate tariff rates, so those countries were not subject to these reciprocal tariffs. These tariffs were imposed as a response to unfair trade practices by other countries and as a result of national security risks. This rate was originally announced at 10%, with the expectation that the rate would rise for individual specific countries at a later point in time, just a few days later. However, this increase was paused for 90 days through to July 9th, which was then extended to August 1st. So, as of right now, almost every country is facing this 10% rate. However, it's important to keep in mind that these don't apply across the board. For example, Mexico and Canada were not subject to these reciprocal tariffs in the beginning. However, the president has been announcing letters via Truth Social, which is a social media application, but these have not resulted in executive orders. These letters are announcing these new tariff rates that are expected to take place on August 1st. Notably, Canada and Mexico each received a letter, and we're unsure of how that will relate back to the fentanyl and immigration tariffs, but we'll have to see whether or not those will stack or whether they will be imposed separately. As we're looking at what we should be keeping an eye out for the future, the president also announced that approximately 150 countries would be receiving letters at the same time with the same tariff rate. So we can keep an eye out for that as well. And of course, China faced higher tariffs than other countries. And at one point, that reciprocal tariff rate was 125%. But due to negotiations with the United States, that rate decreased to 10%, later increased to 34%, which is expected, that 34% increase is expected on August 12th. So those are the IEEPA tariffs. I now want to move into speaking about the Section 232 tariffs of the Trade Expansion Act. These tariffs authorize the president to impose tariffs on goods that are determined to be a threat to U.S. national security. And steel and aluminum tariffs did receive 232 impositions under this act. Now, there have been a few changes as to what portion of steel and aluminum products were subject to tariffs, but currently there's a 25% tariff on the steel and aluminum value of the content of steel and aluminum in products. So that's a 25% tariff on the value of the content of steel and aluminum for both steel and aluminum products and derivatives that are subject to this tariff. We've also seen tariffs on automobiles and auto parts. These tariffs can vary a little bit, but overall, 25% on non-US origin content of automobiles and auto parts in the United States. Now, there's been significant pushback from automobile manufacturers in the United States. And as a result, the president released a tariff offset executive order. This order permitted manufacturers who assemble automobile parts in the United States to apply for their importers to receive an offset, which is a sort of credit on future imports. Now, for 232 tariffs to take place, typically the process that is set forward is an investigation that occurs first. And anyone can begin one of these investigations or request one of these investigations to take place. And the Department of Commerce conducts this investigation. The president can also request that these investigations come in. So we've had a few investigations. I just want to highlight some of them. These haven't yet resulted in tariffs, but there has been talk of them resulting in tariffs. This includes copper, timber and lumber, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, trucks, critical minerals, aircraft and jet engines, polysilicon, and unmanned aircraft systems. From the start date of those investigations, there's a 270-day timeline to report to the president, and the president can then take actions based on trade-related needs as deemed necessary. Keep in mind that there are certain stacking provisions that apply to these tariffs. So for example, if you're subject to the auto tariffs, you won't be subject to the reciprocal or the steel and aluminum tariffs. But if you're subject to the steel and aluminum tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs will only apply if the value of the non-steel and aluminum content of your article. Otherwise, those reciprocal tariffs will not apply to the steel and aluminum content. Now that we've covered these tariffs, I do want to spend just a moment discussing tariff mitigation strategies. The ones to keep in mind are valuation, classification, and country of origin. Valuation is changing a value to change tariff rates. Tariffs are based on a product's value when imported. So if a product's value decreases, then the tariff rate will decrease. Keep in mind that you can't just decrease your value of your product if something hasn't changed. So most of the time, value is based on transaction value, which is the price actually paid or payable for a good plus additional costs. Certain costs can be excluded. These are known as non-dutiable costs. That's one way to decrease your value. Another way is through the first sale rule, which allows you to base a product's valuation on the first or earlier sale in a series of transactions. Another way is through classification. Every product is classified somewhere in the Harmonized Tariff Schedule, or HTS. And classification, of course, impacts tariff rates. So if your product can be classified somewhere else, then you wouldn't be subject to specific tariffs. So reconsidering classification is always an option. And of course, country of origin. Certain tariffs apply to specific countries. So if the origin of your product changes, which again cannot just be changed without a reason, but if the country of origin does change, then that tariff rate might change as well. So at a high level, the test for determining country of origin is substantial transformation. This is based on where a product undergoes a change in name, character, or use. Under this change, the country in which that change last took place determines country of origin. You can also consider lobbying and public comments. These investigations that we mentioned earlier, each of those has a comment period where the public can actually go and comment and submit as to why or why not those tariffs should be put into place. And lastly, of course, we have litigation. We're seeing plenty of litigation surrounding the IEEPA tariff specifically, so do make sure you're keeping an eye on those. It's imperative for all to stay current on executive orders, CBP guidance, Federal Register notices, and updates to the HTS. Consider those tariff mitigation strategies, and I hope that this overview has been helpful to give you an idea of the tariffs that have been imposed thus far in 2025.